All right. Andrew Jackson in action. Jacksonian democracy. So I spoke about the philosophy behind Andrew Jackson in the lecture the other day, and the ideas that were coursing through the United States in his time. And today I want to look at Jackson's presidency and his accomplishments. And every single thing I mention in this lecture, 3 major events in Jackson's presidency are on the exam. So there you go. In terms of the test, an important exam. And this is the 3rd lecture that Andrew Jackson has appeared prominently, right? So again, a suggestion as to significance. You need to know a considerable amount about Andrew Jackson. And if you know that, you're going to do well on 4, 5, 6 questions on the exam. With the end of the world wars between Great Britain and France and all their allies in 1815, where Napoleon met his Waterloo, the world entered into an era of peace. In fact, this era of peace would last in terms of major wars for nearly 100 years. It would be called the Pax Peace Britannica, the peace of Britain, because Britain was the great power, the undisputed mistress of the seas, and hence the Pax Britannica, which was only broken in 1914 with the beginning of what was called, at that time, the Great War. Now, this does not mean that there were not lesser wars, minor skirmishes, revolutions and such, because there were, but there was no world war like there had been consistently in recent history, and as there would be in the 20th century. And there was, after the War of 1812, that part of that world war that we were sucked into, a belief that an era of harmony, of good feelings, had come to the United States. After all, the war had largely killed that Federalist Party, which left the Jeffersonian Republicans in pretty much the only party. And so an era of good feelings. What did we have to fight about? The Federalists are gone. But this era of good feelings did not long last. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise brought to the fore the issue of slavery and the adding of new states to the Union. And the Missouri Compromise, this fight over whether a state should be free or slave, revealed that the era of good feelings was just a facade. Because this was a knockdown, drag-out fight that presaged or foreshadowed a coming conflict that the people in 1820 did not realize would end in civil war, but we do. Then in 1828, Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, was elected President of the United States to the dismay of the upper classes. Oh my gosh, as I pointed out. Yes, people said that in those days too. What has happened? I don't think they had the abbreviation in their texts, OMG, but they said it. Jackson had the luxury of being able to focus on domestic issues because, again, the Pax Britannica, essentially a worldwide era of peace, had descended, and so foreign policy was not Jackson's primary concern. However, domestic issues can be very divisive. In America and in our politics, we generally fight over domestic issues and oftentimes, though not always, unite over a foreign policy issue. So again, domestic issues, things that concern us here at home, can be very divisive. Killing the bank. As we've already seen, the Bank of the United States was a symbol of government by and for the wealthy. It was regarded as an undemocratic institution. The fear was that the wealthy controlled the bank, and the bank then controlled the government because the bank had its its tentacles on the purse strings of the federal government. And he who controls the money controls the government. That was the fear. Jackson now, true to his promise to the common people, and the promise was to destroy the Bank of the United States, to get rid of it, and thus reduce the power of the wealthy and their oppression, so it was thought, of the common people. Indeed, Jackson had made this a center point of his re-election campaign in 1832. Destroy the bank. And Jackson was as good as his word. The bank had a charter. That means it had a contract, and that contract was due to expire in 1836. And when it came up for renewal, Jackson refused, and so without the renewal of the charter, the bank dies. It goes away. What happens after the bank goes away, though, is a financial panic. You see, the bank then and the Federal Reserve Bank now were stabilizing influences on the economy. And with the disappearance of the bank, you lose that stabilizing influence, and there's a panic on Wall Street that turns into a serious economic decline. Another word for that is a recession. You would pay attention to modern politics. We're either going into a recession, we're coming out of a recession, or we're afraid that there might be a recession, right? An economic decline. Right now, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of the United States, if you will, though not quite the same thing, but the same function, is very concerned that the economy is weakening. We might be going into a recession, so for the last 3 or 4 months, they've been reducing interest rates to help the economy. When Jackson killed the Bank of the United States, the economy slipped into a deep, deep decline that frankly ruined many of the people, ruined them financially, many of the people that Jackson thought he was helping. So, irony upon irony. In the early 20th century, we will realize Jackson's mistake, the mistake of the people at this time, and we will recreate a central bank, which we call the Federal Reserve System. And were it not for the Federal Reserve System in the Great Recession, we probably would have entered into a Great Depression. So, I think we've learned that lesson, although there are people in America today who want to do what? They want to do like Jackson and get rid of the Federal Reserve. See? So understanding these issues then and now helps you understand the world you live in. And I think that goes without explaining as to why it's important. So the bank is gone. The country enters into a recession. The Trail of Tears. Another incredibly important development in American history. As a Southerner and a Westerner, Tennessee, right? That's where Jackson was from. Jackson, unfortunately, possessed the failings of many of his countrymen from those regions, and not a few people in the North. He considered Indians to be inferior to whites. In fact, anybody of color is inferior to whites for most Americans at this time. And Jackson covets the land of the Native Americans, especially in the southeastern corner of the country, as do the whites who live there as well, by and large. Are there exceptions in history? Absolutely. In fact, historians are fond of saying that there's never a never in history, and there's never an always in history, because there are always exceptions. It's a good rule to remember. But in this case, the generality is true. Under Andrew Jackson, the United States initiated a wholesale removal of the southeastern tribes to lands west of the Mississippi. Why? So that the white people could have their lands. It's that simple. The lands west of the Mississippi, otherwise known as the Great Plains, were thought to be worthless move the Indians out there. Now, we know today that the Great Plains are places where one grows tremendous quantities of corn and wheat and raise large numbers of livestock and so forth. But in those days, even on the maps, it said, the Great American Desert. Who needs a desert? Give it to the Indians and let us take the lands where they live now, which were great agricultural lands and forested and so forth. The Chickasaws and the Choctaws signed agreements with the federal government and were moved in the early 1830s. The Seminoles put up a fight. The Seminoles of the Florida and Georgia area decided they weren't going to go out west. And so they retreated into the swamps and so forth, where it was difficult for the American forces to get to them. And a few of them had to give up, but many of them remained right where they were. And to this day, Florida State University is referred to as, in terms of their nickname, the Seminoles. And on their football helmets, they have the spearhead or arrowhead. Right? And so many of the Seminoles were able to stay because they retreated into the swamps and such. But the most informative case, the most tragic case, concerned the Cherokees of northwestern Georgia. These people had adopted farming as the white people said that they should do, as opposed to insisting on their traditional way of life as hunter-gatherers. So they had accommodated themselves to white civilization. And many of them even became Christians. The missionaries, friends of the Native Americans, were welcomed amongst the Cherokees. So here were whites who were sympathetic to Native Americans, not just the Cherokees, but many tribes, missionaries. One seldom reads about this in modern secular histories. That's a mistake. That's a bias. It's a bias against Christianity. In the late 1820s, the Cherokees adopted a written constitution, emulating, of course, the United States, and they set up as a separate nation within the enclaves of the state of Georgia. And this was their right to do under federal law. Today, if you were to go to a reservation, the laws of Oregon do not apply in reservations within the state of Oregon, or any other state for that matter. The gas taxes are different inside a reservation because the laws of Oregon don't apply there. See? The Native Americans can do things within their reservations that were illegal in other parts of the state. For example, gambling casinos. Now that's gradually changing. But there was a day when that was true. Well, the people of Georgia, the white people of Georgia, did not like the fact that the Cherokees were asserting their rights, and it looked like they were going to be there forever. And so the people of Georgia then proceeded to attempt to establish Georgia's jurisdiction over the Cherokee lands. The Cherokees resisted. And the federal government was relatively friendly to the Native Americans, especially the Cherokees, but the state government, the local people, were not. Eventually, a lawsuit now is brought, a lawsuit brought by missionaries who were friendly to the Cherokees, who lived amongst them. They said, hey, let's take a lawsuit. Let's keep the people of Georgia from establishing their control over you. Which is why this lawsuit is called Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester versus Georgia. This lawsuit makes its way up to the Supreme Court in 1832. And unlike many Supreme Court decisions, this one's not hard to comprehend at all. The court, under the leadership of the Chief Justice John Marshall, one of the great Chief Justices in our history, declared that the laws of Georgia could have no force over Cherokee lands. None whatsoever. that the attempt by the people of Georgia to establish control over Cherokee lands was unconstitutional. Marshall wrote, "The Cherokee Nation, then, is a distinct community, occupying its own territory, with boundaries accurately described, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force." In other words, it's a separate country from Georgia. Now, Georgia ignored the decision. After all, it's the Supreme Court way far away in Washington, D.C. Now, whose responsibility is it to enforce the court's decision? Whose constitutional duty is it? The President of the United States takes an oath of office. "I will faithfully enforce the laws of the United States, the Constitution of the United States." Right? That's the oath of office, paraphrase it. And the Supreme Court has no military forces at its disposal, does it? The Chief Justice Marshall is not the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. Who is that? President of the United States. It's his job to enforce the laws. He has at his disposal the force to do it. And now what does Andrew Jackson do? Nothing. Nothing. As I began the lecture, he has the prejudices of the people of the South and the West in terms of how they see Indians, and again, a lot of the people of the North as well. He sees these Native Americans as inferior, in spite of the fact that the Cherokees, perhaps more advanced than any other tribe in terms of white civilization. After all, they were farmers. They had a constitution. They had created an alphabet to put their language in written form. They had accepted missionaries, many of them Christians. The Supreme Court was on their side. People of Georgia were not. It's all up to the President of the United States, and he does nothing. Now, whose will is going to prevail? The people of Georgia outnumber the Native Americans. And now Jackson actually puts his authority on the side of Indian removal. You see? So the Cherokees lose their political fight, even though they won their legal fight. And they will go out west to the great American desert. In fact, Jackson is reputed to have said in this regard, Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Yeah, he knows he can't. That's the president's job. In other words, Jackson's will prevail. So the removal of the Cherokees went forward in the late 1830s. Altogether, all the Indian removals saw the relocation of 46,000 Native Americans from the southeast largely, although some in the Midwest as well, out beyond the Mississippi River. In 1838 alone, perhaps as many as 4,000 Cherokees died on the so-called Trail of Tears. They were moved. They weren't ready to be moved. They weren't properly taken care of. They weren't provided for in terms of food and clothing and protection from the elements. The Indian removal of the 1830s, though it did not have the approval of all Americans, is nevertheless one of the tragic chapters of our history. A conscientious people, a people with a conscience, do not want to forget these kinds of episodes, lest they fall into them again. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a great writer of the 19th century, said of this event, Such a dereliction and abandonment of all faith and virtue, such a denial of justice, and such deafness to screams for mercy were never heard of in time of peace and in the dealing of a nation with its own allies and wards since the earth was made. Remember I told you that Andrew Jackson was a man of contradictions? It's a good way to remember Jackson. He's inconsistent. You never really know what to expect from Andrew Jackson. Ironically, Jackson adopted an Indian boy and raised him as his own son. Jackson was indeed full of contradictions. Fortunately, Andrew Jackson had better moments as President of the United States. Nothing demonstrates this more clearly than the nullification controversy. So again, those three major events I told you about, you've got the Bank of the United States and how Jackson ended it and what the results were. You've got the Trail of Tears and the controversy with the Chief Justice of the United States. And now you've got the nullification controversy. In 1832, Jackson had agreed to sign a tariff bill which did not reduce the tariff rates as much as his Western and Southern supporters had hoped. He's elected on a platform of reducing the tariff. And again, the tariff is seen as the tool of who? The rich, the wealthy, those who own large businesses and so forth are protected by high tariff rates. That is, they're able then to raise their prices of whatever they're manufacturing because the imported European goods of the same kind have to pay the tariff. So if you're a businessman, you want a tariff. You want a high tariff. But if you're a consumer, this allows, of course, these businessmen to raise their prices. If you're a consumer, you don't like the tariff because prices for goods are higher, you see. The tariff is, again, a huge issue today. And so Jackson had promised to reduce the tariff, but the new tariff bill that he signed, the tariff rates came down, but not as much as the Southerners and Westerners wanted. Indeed, South Carolina was angered over this failure of their man. Jackson's a Southerner and a Westerner, and yet, the tariff is still way too high. It seemed the protective tariff was here to stay no matter who was in the White House. Consequently, South Carolina decides to do something about it. And they are led by John C. Calhoun. And the legislature of South Carolina passed a law known as the Ordinance of Nullification. The Ordinance of Nullification. And again, it sounds complicated, but it's really quite simple. If you nullify something, it's as if it never existed, okay? In fact, sometimes people decide that after a day or two of marriage, they want to have that marriage what? Annulled, same word, to nullify it, as if it never existed, okay? So there you go. South Carolina is saying that if they believe a federal law, the tariff, is unconstitutional, then they have the ability to act as if it is null and void, to nullify it, that is, to not obey it. This raises the specter of secession, doesn't it? What happens if after a number of times a state has nullified a federal law, eventually they just throw up their hands and say, hey, why do we bother being a state? We don't agree with anything these people do. Let's just secede. See? So nullification is a step towards secession. And hopefully you all know that eventually, in late 1860 and early 1861, most of the southern states are going to say, hey, there's nothing left for us to do but secede, right? To get out of the Union. So we are no longer under the control of these federal laws, right? So the nullification controversy is a foreshadowing of the secession crisis that leads to civil war. The issue, though, is not slavery as it would be then. The issue is the tariff. And South Carolina has claimed the authority to nullify federal law. Now, just to make this relevant to you, although I think it should be no matter what, but today we have major cities in the United States who ignore federal law and declare that they are not going to cooperate. This is specifically to do with immigration law. They declare that they are sanctuary cities and they are not going to obey federal law regarding immigration. And they don't. They don't cooperate with federal authorities. And so far, they have gotten away with it. So, again, same theory. We don't like the federal law. We're not going to obey it. And so they thumb their noses at the federal government. And the point here is not whether the cities are right or the federal government is right. I'm just explaining this so you understand the issue is still with us. People deciding that they don't like federal law and they're not going to obey it. On how many things, on how many times will you do something like that until you throw up your hands and say, you know what? We just don't even want to be part of the union with you anymore. So this is the nullification crisis. And South Carolina is arguing now that the tariffs, the high tariffs of those days, were not constitutional because they were clearly designed to protect northern industry, that is, to allow those industries to have high prices. Whereas the Constitution only allows for a tariff that is designed to create revenue at our ports. Okay, that's what happens when you import something. Let's say you import shoes. And so there is a customs agent on the dock. Here's 5 tons of shoes coming in off the ship. They're coming from France. The tariff on shoes is $5 a ton, whatever. And so now there's 5 tons, so that's $25, and then the importer has to pay that to the customs agent, and the money then goes where? To the federal government. That's how a tariff works. Only it can be obviously millions of dollars. So you have to understand that because, again, the tariff is still part of the issue today. The other thing the tariff does that's more relevant to today is that it protects American industry, yes, and the profits, but it also protects American jobs, you see. So that's why the tariff is popular today among some Americans, because it protects our jobs. Well, so South Carolina then is arguing that the tariff is unconstitutional because it's so high, it protects industry, and it doesn't really just raise revenue. And so this is raising the specter, the ghost of secession. Jackson's response was swift and certain. This time, Jackson's volatility, his temper, serves him well. He sent additional troops to forts in Charleston, South Carolina. Federal troops now on the periphery of the state. And then he amassed more federal troops on the border of South Carolina in North Carolina. The threat is obvious. I will use military force. And then in December of 1832, he issued a proclamation to the people of South Carolina, but to all Americans who were sympathetic to South Carolina. I consider the power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state incompatible with the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle upon which it was founded, and destructive of the great object, unity, for which it was formed. Jackson was clearly prepared to use force if necessary. But while he is blustering, while he's sending troops, behind the scenes he's also negotiating with South Carolina's representatives. He doesn't want to use force, but he has to make it appear as if he's perfectly willing to do so, maybe even anxious to do so, to get them to negotiate in good faith. Well, a compromise on the tariff is reached with South Carolina and others who wanted to see the tariff reduced. So over the next few years, the tariff is gradually reduced year after year. And the tariff issue will gradually fade away to be replaced by what? What was the great issue then that replaces the tariff that brings the country to division, secession? Slavery. South Carolina, for its part, nullified its nullification law. But South Carolina does not abandon its right to nullify a federal law in the future if it sees the need. Nullification and the issue of states' rights, the state's right to nullify a federal law, a state's right to secede from the Union if it feels like that's the only constitutional course, if it feels itself aggrieved constitutionally. Those are not going away. But indeed, the states' rights issue grows ever stronger over the coming years, especially as the subject of slavery grew more and more important. Now, just a brief time out here before I get to the summary. Why does the subject of slavery grow ever more important? From the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and so forth. What's going on in the country that makes many, many people, mainly in the North, some in the West, concerned over the topic of slavery? Concerned is even eventually too light a word. Agitated, irate over slavery. Why? Because of the Second Great Awakening, largely. There are other issues, but it is largely because of the Second Great Awakening and the revival of Christianity and the spread of Christianity and the increased moral concern over slavery that goes with it that creates this great divide in America. So many Christians then in the North become concerned of their support for Southern slavery, you see, and then begin to campaign to end it. And the Southerners become more and more defensive, especially as their economy grows more and more dependent upon the slaves for the harvesting of cotton and other crops. See? Now, it's more complicated than I've just suggested, but those are the large parameters of the issue, okay? Summary. Andrew Jackson had a momentous impact on American life. He had forged a new political party, the Democratic Party. A party still with us today, though vastly changed from the time when Jackson was its head. He had infused it with the mission of freeing enterprise, another word for business, by removing government-granted privileges. And hopefully the two things that leap to your mind here is the Bank of the United States, a government privilege for the wealthy, and the high tariff, again, a government privilege for the wealthy. It was a national party, too, with a large following in the North, the South, the East, and the West. He had elevated the common man and reduced the power of the wealthy. Though not equal in practice, the wealthy and the common men were becoming more so in theory and reality as well. Today, Jackson's Democratic Party still pursues policies that are very popular with average Americans. Jackson's record as president is very uneven, even contradictory. Many of his policies had adverse and unintended consequences. In killing the bank, a Democratic move largely demanded by average Americans, Jackson damaged the financial system of the United States and the economic well-being of average Americans. In removing the Native American tribes of the Southeast to lands across the Mississippi River, he damaged the Supreme Court and wrote another chapter in the tragic history of American racism. However, in standing up to South Carolina over nullification. He was at his best as he stood for the Union over the power of the state. In addition, we can only marvel at this. Andrew Jackson paid off the national debt in 1835. In 1835, largely because of Jackson, the United States owed no one. Today we owe $22 trillion. That's T, trillion. I'm happy about one thing. I probably won't be here to pay that bill. Well, finally, Andrew Jackson enhanced the power of the presidency. The Constitution provided for a government in which the branches are in tension with one another, in which there is a balance between federal power and state power. This tension was brought to new heights during Jackson's term in office. And in spite of his own theory of limited government and the rule of the people, Jackson dramatically increased the power of the presidency over the states, over the Congress, and even over the Supreme Court. This was not what most people meant by more democracy. And some people called Jackson a tyrant, a dictator. Hardly the democratic leader. Questions? Yes?
What was the compromise in South Carolina?
Okay, so it's a compromise to simply lower the tariff over the coming years. That is worked out over those years as well, okay? Yeah, we'll never ask you something like, well, what exactly was the tariff rate in 1837 or something like that. The point is that it's going to be declining over the years, and gradually the issue actually recedes from significance. Okay. Somebody else? Any other questions? So what are major points of this lecture? Major points.
Three things Andrew Jackson did.
Yeah, so what's one of them?
Killing the bank.
Okay, killing the bank, right? So you need to know what the bank issue was all about. What else? What? Yeah, what's the Trail of Tears? Where's the conflict there, right? You need to know something about the Trail of Tears, the salient or important points. All right? What else? Yeah, nullification. And specifically, not only what it is, but why it remains important. What are the concepts here that are still with us today? Okay? All right. Important people. Yeah, John Marshall. Don't let John Marshall escape you there. He becomes prominent many years before in the case Marbury versus Madison, all right, which establishes the principle that the Supreme Court rules on constitutional issues. So be sure you know what Marbury versus Madison is about. But also then, of course, in this case, Worcester versus Georgia, where Andrew Jackson simply ignores John Marshall. An unconstitutional act. Okay. All right, God bless you all, and I'll see you next time.